In your presence this morning, you heard there was part of the story about Ruth. A bit of background, perhaps, for that story. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, is a Hebrew, an Israelite. But when hard times come, Naomi and Elimelech, her husband, leave their homeland and they go to Moab. And they have a couple of boys. They have a couple of sons. And in due time, these two sons marry Moabite women. That is, Orpah and Ruth. And then, Naomi's husband dies. And then, Orpah's husband and Ruth's husband died. And Naomi is a foreigner in a foreign land. And that time of famine and economic problems has kind of passed by, if you please, back around Jerusalem. And so Naomi decides that she needs to return home, and she has kinsmen there, she has family there, and she decides she better go back to her homeland. And she says to her two daughter-in-laws, "You're young. You can find another husband. You can have children. It makes no sense for you to leave your homeland, your people, and go back with me." And so Orpah considers that, and Orpah leaves Naomi and goes back to her extended family. But in the reading of the scripture, you heard Ruth say, "I am going to stick with you. I will go with you back to your homeland. Your people will be my people. Where you live, I will live. Where you die, I will die." And then, and I can't remember this verse, and so I need to read it to you. Think about these words where she says, so the two, your people will be my people, your God my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. This is the word I was looking for. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you from me. I want us to think about loyalty and commitment this morning. And I wonder how many of us would say to a Naomi, or in essence would say to God, "Deal with me severely if I don't keep my commitments." I am concerned that we live in a culture where commitments aren't honored, where loyalty is almost non-existent.
Amen.
Now, this is going to sound a little bit self-serving to you, but in the 1930s, my grandparents drove a Ford. And so when my dad graduated from high school, he hitchhiked to Detroit, and he bought a Model T Ford, and he took off for California. At some point, he had a little trouble with that, and he ended up without a vehicle. But when he got back to Michigan, he bought a 1938 Ford. You see a pattern? We were Ford people. Now that changed. Or let me use another example. Now this is a bit of a problem to me. Some of you know that I lost my wife 5 years ago, and 3 years ago I remarried, and the first tractor that I can remember my dad having was a John Deere H. That's not a very big tractor, but that was the first tractor that we had. And then they got a John Deere G, and physically that was a big tractor. It wasn't as powerful as its physical size made it look like it was going to be, but it was a big. And then they got a John Deere 620. Do you see any pattern there? John Deere people. Very large. Boy, them people have red tractors. Well, that's okay. I try not to say too much. It doesn't really matter much, I don't think, whether I think it's important to continue to drive a Ford, and I happen to drive a Ford right now. First one I ever drove that I owned. But what I suspect is that people who don't have loyalty in one area of their life might not have loyalty in other areas of their life. People who don't keep commitments in one area of their life find it too easy to not keep commitments in other areas of your life.
Amen.
I suspect that our culture breeds a little bit of the lack of loyalty. And I'm going to sound like an old fogey, and some of you that are a tad younger can call me out on this if you want to. But the reality is that people from my generation tended to have their automobile insurance with a particular dealer and a particular company, and we tended to stay with it, didn't we?
Amen.
And yet, you know what? Today's generation, when they get ready to renew their insurance, their automobile insurance, don't they go online and they just start searching to see if they can save a few dollars? I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with that. But what I am concerned about is that we're not going to have people who make a commitment like Ruth made a promise and have any sense of the importance of keeping those commitments and keeping those promises. Life is full of examples. I have a nephew. He's married and has a child now, but you know, a number of years ago, he was living with a young lady. He was a student at Michigan State. I think that's a good place to go to school. She was a student at Cooley Law School. I think that was a good place to go to school. They're a nice couple, and quite frankly, although some folk, we were a little uncomfortable with the choices they were making. And these were unchurched people. These were not Christian people. And so, you know what, they lived together about 5 years, and all about the same time, he finished his master's degree at Michigan State, and she's about to study for her bar exam because she's done at Cooley Law School, and the next family get together, some of us think, you know what, I'll bet there's going to be some kind of an announcement. This couple have been together 5 years. And the announcement was they broke up. Well, some of us are bold. This is family. So we ask why. Well, she wasn't ready to make a commitment, and I wasn't ready to make a commitment. Well, what's the last 5 years been? Our relationship to God and our relationship to God's church is about commitment.
Amen.
Hanging in there, staying with it. And I'm concerned that as society out there seems to place almost no value on making making commitments and keeping commitments, that begins to bleed over into our relationship with God and into our relationship with God's church. Ruth says, I made a commitment to you, and even if it means going to a strange foreign land, I will keep my commitment. I made a commitment to you, and if that means I have to leave my homeland and my extended family, I will honor my commitment to you. That's a model for our commitment to God.
Amen.
So God calls us. God calls us. And when we respond to that call, we make a commitment. And we ought to value the depth of that commitment so that we could use the words of Ruth that says, you know what, God, if I go back on my commitment, God, if I go back on my promises, God, deal with me severely if I fail in my relationship to you. We live in a covenant relationship with God through Jesus Christ. I have another story that I want to tell you that I think is illustrative of the church today. I live about 35 or 40 miles from Ann Arbor, and I got a phone call. I live close to the Ohio state line, and I got a phone call from a pastor down in Ohio whose brother was at the U of M, and he was floating around, and somehow he got my name, and he asked me if I would be willing to go visit his brother in the hospital. And so I went to the U of M, and that's never a real pleasant experience. It's not always comfortable walking as far as you have to walk to get there. So I go to the U of M, and I find this gentleman, and I find his wife, and we had a good time sharing together. And I discovered that this man was raised in the Church of God. He had grown up in a Christian family, and his brother was a pastor in the Church of God down in southeast Ohio. And this man had been part of the church his whole life. And for reasons either I didn't know or have forgotten, they moved from the southeast Ohio area down in the hill country, and they moved up towards the Toledo area. And so we're talking about the Church of God, and we're talking about its history, and we're talking about some of its music, and we're just kind of having a pretty good time and educating my wife a little bit more about the Church of God in this process. And so as we're talking, at some point I said to him, well, where do you worship now? And there's this moment of silence. Well, they had moved up towards the Toledo area, in kind of west of Toledo a little bit. And they'd only been there a couple of years, and they hadn't found a church. I can't not find churches. You've got to drive with your eyes closed if you can't find a church. Now, I'm going to be right up front with you and say I don't consider all churches created equal by any sense. But here's what I know. These people lived, I know the Toledo area a little bit, they lived about 15 or 16, maybe 18 miles from two congregations of the Church of God and other good congregations that I'm very sure of. And I listened to these folk talk about going to Anderson camp meeting. I had listened to them talk, and I'm thinking, what happened to your commitment to God?
Amen.
And what happened to your commitment to God's church?
That's right.
You see, there was a time when from rural areas like Charlotte, Michigan, kids grew up in the church, and they very often left home, didn't they? I did. Kids leave home. They leave home because they go off to college someplace. They leave home because they join the service. They go into the military. They leave home because jobs take them some places. But there was a day, wasn't there, when we had loyalty? Loyalty to God and loyalty to God's church. And so it didn't matter where I went, whenever I got there or wherever I got, I started looking around for a church.
Amen.
And I'm a minister, and so I suppose that's maybe even more important to me, but I've moved a number of times. And one of the first things we do is we look for a church. I moved to Columbia, South Carolina. On Monday, I have to report to start my year residency. On Sunday, I'm in church. It's more important to me to find the church. Now, there was a time when that was common for all of us, wasn't it?
Amen.
Now we're in a day when people seem to be able to break commitments and forget promises and walk away.
Amen.
God calls us to our commitments to our families. Ruth married into Naomi's family, and that's family. And you have commitment to your family. When you stand before God, I don't care where you did your marriage ceremony, when you stand before God and you promise to love one another, to cherish one another, you know the routine, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor. That's a commitment that you're making. And we suffer because people find it easy to break that commitment.
Amen.
I don't know all of you, and I don't know all of your families, and if I step on some toes, I stepped on some toes. It is way too easy today, isn't it? For parents, and usually this is fathers, but in some cases it's mothers, to walk away from children. Whatever happened to commitment? Whatever happened to loyalty? God calls us to keep our promises. God calls us to keep our promises to the church. That's changing in our culture. Do you know that about 60% of the people who physically move their address, that 60% of churched people, now this is broader than some of our definitions of Christian, but 60% of churched people, and some studies say in some parts of the country, 70% of churched people, when they physically, geographically move where they live, they do not reconnect with another church for 5 years. The study lasted 5 years. I have a covenant relationship with God through Jesus Christ. God says, you can find that in a lot of places. Jeremiah is one of the places. God says that He will be my God, and I will be His people. And God keeps His part of that covenant, It doesn't make any difference where I've gone, what I've done, the moves I've made. God has kept that promise. He is my God. He doesn't say he'll be my God until I do something stupid. Fortunately. He doesn't say he'll be my God as long as he says he will be my God. But he says I am his people. When I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, I became his people. I am God's child. And covenant relationships have responsibilities on both parties to the covenant. So God has responsibility to me. Does that sound bold? God has responsibility to me because I have accepted him. He said if I would believe and accept him, he would save me. He has that responsibility. He said that he will never leave me nor forsake me. He has that responsibility. God says he'll be with me always, even to the end of the earth. He has that responsibility. God never shirks his responsibility. Well, what about me? I have responsibility to God. And I have responsibility to God's church. I am a child of the church. I am a person who probably stands alive, living today, because of the prayers of the church. I am a person who was nurtured by the church. I am a person who has been blessed by the church. I have a commitment to the church. Well, Ruth said, God, may you deal with me even severely if I don't keep my word, if I don't keep my promises, if I don't keep my commitments. Let me take you over to the book of Acts, and this is probably just as familiar a story, or maybe even a more familiar story. If we go to if we go to the book of Acts, let's see if I had that written in the bulletin, because I don't do finding things in my notes.
5th chapter.
Pardon?
5th chapter.
Okay, let's go to Acts chapter 5. Now a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but he brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. And then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied to men, but to God. When Ananias heard this, he fell down and died. And great fear seized all who heard what had happened. And then the young men came forward, they wrapped up his body, they carried him out and buried him. About 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said. I'd like to change that. Yes, she lied. That is the price. But you see, when people lie, they never tell you they're lying, do they? So, yes, she said, that is the price. Peter said to her, how could you agree to test the Spirit of the Lord? Look, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. At that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. And the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. And great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events. Breaking your promises to God is pretty serious business.
Amen.
Now, if we read this story, didn't we hear this? Peter says, the land was yours. The land was yours. You could do anything you wanted to. You could sell it and keep all the money yourself. The land was yours. And even after you sold it, the money was yours. But you made a promise to God. And you reneged on your commitment to God. We think of this story as very, very harsh. I think of this story as very harsh. But I think it illustrates how serious it is if we don't keep our promises to God. If we don't keep our word to God. Yes, and even I think it speaks about the importance of our commitment to the church. I went to a conference a while back, and they were talking some about the changes in the church world and all, and the pastor made the statement that in his church, anything he announced, he had to announce 4 Sundays in a row, because a lot of his people showed up at church about every 4th Sunday. You know, maybe if the weather was bad, they'd meet in the 3rd Sunday, but frequently it wasn't until the 4th Sunday. Whatever happened to loyalty to the church? Churches struggle financially because people make commitments to be stewards of that which God has blessed them with. Take times come economically, and so people break their promise to God. They break their commitment to God. I know not all of you have been a part of this congregation for years or generations, but there's loyalty in congregation. And what makes a congregation thrive, what makes a congregation grow, is when we recognize that this is our church, this is our congregation. We're committed to this body of people that meets in this place. And because of the fellowship of the body of Jesus Christ, we are comfortable in inviting other people. We encourage other people to come and be a part. And so here's a man who moved. And it didn't take him a couple of weeks to find another church. It didn't take him a couple of months to find another church. Here he is laying up in a hospital bed, seriously ill, hasn't been to church, hasn't been to any church, hasn't joined with a body of believers, hasn't given his money to support the work of God, has had no commitment whatsoever. I didn't read Luke chapter 5 to him. But when we don't keep our commitments to God, we don't keep our commitments to God's church, it is serious to the point of death. Maybe sometimes spiritual death.
Amen.
Because when I start breaking my promises to God, I start trying to get as far from God as I can get. And the process of spiritual death begins to happen. Father, these are your people, called by your name. And these are good people, Father. And so I would pray that in whatever commitments we have, that we would honor them. Father, I pray for every family that's here. And I look, Father, and I know that there are folk here who've experienced the death of family members and the loss of spouses and life changes. And it seems very different. And yet, Father, most of us have family members. And so, Father, help us to honor our commitment to our family members. Father, help us to honor our commitments to your church. Most of all, Father, deal with us ever so severely if we